The wedding of the century was a lie. A beautiful, brilliant, breathtaking lie. Orchestrated for a nation drowning in the blood of its own civil war. New York City, February 1863. The snow fell like a shroud over the Union's grief. But for one day, the war was forgotten. All eyes were on Grace Church, where the elite of America, the money, the power, the politics gathered to witness a fairy tale. They came to see the marriage of General Tom Thumb and the Lilliputian Queen, Lavinia Warren. He was the most famous small person in the world, the prized creation of the master showman, P.T. Barnum. She was his newly crowned consort, a woman of impossible proportions and unshakable poise. The newspapers called it the union of Cupid and Psyche. President Lincoln himself had hosted them at the White House, a welcome distraction from the casualty lists. But as Lavinia walked down that aisle, draped in satin and diamonds, gifted by Barnum, a question hung in the perfumed air, unspoken but understood by the shrewd minds in the pews. Was this love? Or was this the single greatest publicity stunt ever conceived? Was the bride a woman finding her soulmate, or an asset securing her market value in the most bizarre transaction imaginable? The truth, as always, was far more complicated and far more tragic. To find it, we must leave the glare of the gaslights and travel back to a place of stark simplicity, to a farmhouse in Massachusetts, where a name was whispered into the autumn air, a name that promised both Puritan resilience and a destiny no one could have predicted. Mercy Lavinia Warren Bump. She was born on Halloween, 1841, a fact Barnum would later adore for its theatricality. Her parents, James and Huldah Bump, were hard-working people of modest means, but immense pride. Descended from the original Mayflower stock, in the small town of Middleborough, lineage mattered. For the first year of her life, Lavinia was just another Bump child, the fifth of 9, lost in the happy chaos of a large farm family. But then, the rhythm faltered. While her siblings shot upwards, Lavinia remained static. Her mother, a practical woman, would mark the wall with a piece of charcoal, tracking the heights of her children. Lavinia's mark never moved. It stayed there, a stubborn testament to a mystery. Doctors came, their black bags filled with useless instruments and even more useless theories. They spoke of glandular failures, of nature's caprices. Lavinia learned her first lesson in performance, the art of stillness, of letting their gazes slide off her. Her parents, however, refused to see her as a curiosity. To them, she was not a dwarf, she was Lavinia. They armed her not with pity, but with a fierce sense of self-worth. This was the unshakable foundation that would later allow her to stand before kings and not feel small. But the world outside the farm was not so kind. In a town where conformity was scripture, her difference was a spectacle. Yet it was the pity that wounded her most deeply. The soft, sad smiles that saw her as a broken thing. It was her mother who taught her the most crucial survival skill: how to command a room with her mind. Your body is not your measure, Huldah would say. Your mind is limitless. Fill it. And so Lavinia did. She devoured books and had a prodigious memory. Her voice, clear and melodic, became her instrument. She dreamed of being a teacher, a profession where knowledge was the only height that mattered. At 16, she achieved that dream. She was hired to teach the first grade class in Middleborough. The school board was hesitant, but her quiet confidence was undeniable. The children accepted her completely. To them, she wasn't a spectacle. She was Miss Warren, the woman who could unravel the mysteries of the alphabet. But a familiar restlessness began to stir. Her life felt like a circle. She was respected, she was safe, but she was also contained. She yearned for a world that was as large as the one she'd read about in her books. The catalyst for change arrived in a creased envelope, a letter from a cousin on a Mississippi riverboat. He told her about a floating museum of curiosities and an offer, a salary that dwarfed her teacher's pay and a chance to be admired, not pitied. He wrote, "They will look at you with wonder, not sorrow." This was a revolutionary idea, the chance to control the gaze, to shape the narrative. The decision terrified her family. But Lavinia was resolute. This was not about being put on display. It was about seizing an opportunity. Stepping onto that riverboat was like stepping into another dimension. She was billed as the little queen of fairyland. Her act was simple. She sat on a miniature throne, conversed politely, and sang. To her astonishment, she was a sensation. People were charmed by her intelligence, her refined manners, and her complete lack of shame. She was becoming Lavinia Warren, the performer. News of this tiny, articulate marvel soon traveled all the way to a cluttered office in New York City. Phineas Taylor Barnum did not discover talent. He recognized opportunity. By the early 1860s, his American Museum was a chaotic cathedral of curiosities. His golden goose, General Tom Thumb Charles Stratton, was a man in his 20s, and his appeal was beginning to fade. Barnum needed a new sensation. When his scouts brought him news of the Lilliputian queen, his instincts roared to life. He sent a telegram. "Get her, whatever the cost." Barnum immediately set about refining her public persona. He embellished her backstory, inventing a fictitious lineage of tiny ancestors. He dressed her in the finest silks, positioning her on a velvet stage set. She was to be a lady of the highest society, receiving her public as a queen receives her court. But Barnum's vision extended beyond the museum walls. He saw the ultimate theatrical production, a royal wedding. He already had the king. Now he had found his queen. He arranged for Charles Stratton to happen upon Lavinia. The press, expertly fed by Barnum's team, went wild. The courtship of the world's most famous little people became the biggest celebrity story of the age. Was there genuine love? It's impossible to know. They were, in essence, the only two people on the planet who could truly understand the bizarre reality of each other's lives. A bond certainly formed, whether romantic or strategic. There was a complication. Another of Barnum's performers, Commodore Nutt, had also fallen for Lavinia. This, for Barnum, was a goldmine. He fanned the flames of the rivalry, staging public confrontations and leaking stories of a love triangle to the press. It was the greatest reality show of the 19th century. Ultimately, Lavinia chose Charles. The engagement was announced, and Barnum immediately began planning the wedding. It would not be a private affair. It would be a public spectacle to momentarily eclipse the horrors of the Civil War. He booked Grace Church. The guest list included Astors, Vanderbilts, and politicians. Tiffany & Co. provided custom silver. Barnum sold tickets to the reception for an exorbitant price. The wedding gifts included a miniature sleigh from President Lincoln. For one day, Mercy Lavinia Warren Bump of Middleborough was the most famous woman in America. The wedding was a triumph, Barnum's masterpiece. It cemented their fame and fortune, transforming them into a global super couple. But a custom-built house in Connecticut, no matter how perfectly appointed, can also be a cage. The pressure to maintain the public fairy tale was immense. Their lives were not their own. They belonged to Barnum and to the crowds. Behind the carefully constructed facade, reality began to intrude. Lavinia became pregnant, a fact Barnum tried to keep private, fearing it would break the illusion. In the winter of 1869, she gave birth to a daughter. The child tragically died within a few months. The grief was immense, a private sorrow that had no place in the public narrative of their perfect miniature lives. The years that followed were a whirlwind of endless touring. Charles grew weary and began to drink heavily. Their relationship became strained under the weight of constant performance. Lavinia, ever the pragmatist, took on more and more responsibility. In 1883, the fairy tale came to an abrupt end. Charles Stratton, General Tom Thumb, died of a stroke at the age of 45. The world mourned the loss of a legend. But for Lavinia, it was a more complex bereavement. She had lost her husband, her partner, her and, in a way, her captor. The public expected her to retreat. But Lavinia Warren was never one to follow a script written by others. 2 years after Charles's death, she shocked the public and infuriated Barnum. She got married again. She wed another small person, Count Primo. Barnum saw it as a betrayal of the brand. Lavinia saw it as a choice, an assertion of her own life and her own future. She and the Count formed their own troupe and continued to tour. But the world was changing. Vaudeville was replacing the old museum shows. She lived well into the 20th century, a relic from a bygone era. She saw the advent of the automobile and the motion picture. In 1915, she appeared in a silent film. She eventually retired back to Middleborough, the town she had been so desperate to escape, when she died in 1919 at the age of 78. She was no longer the Lilliputian queen. She was Mercy Lavinia Warren Bump Magritte, a woman who had seen the world, dined with presidents, and known great fame and profound sorrow. Her life was a strange and brilliant paradox. She was a woman who was sold as a fairy tale queen but who was, at her core, a pragmatic New England businesswoman. She took the one attribute the world tried to define her by her. Season turned it into a source of power, wealth, and unprecedented independence for a woman of her time. The wedding in Grace Church may have been a lie, a beautiful piece of theater, but the strength, the resilience, and the unshakable dignity of the woman at the altar, that was the absolute truth. Would you like to hear more stories about P.T. Barnum's famous attractions, such as the Fiji Mermaid or Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale?